Hey, Positive Filter listeners, it's Philip Wilkerson back with a special episode of the podcast. A few weeks ago, I hosted a podcast panel at George Mason University, and so I had various guests share their experiences with podcasting and how they got started. And so I want to, share this episode or this live podcast that I did for this panel with the listeners of Positive Filter. But before I do, I want to give a few shout outs. I want to give a shout out to Roger Smith from WGMU, and he's a faculty member in the School of Communications. He helped record this podcast for us, and so I'm really appreciative of all his help. And he really was instrumental in us being able to do this. Colleen from Finding the Fantastic, Ronald Young from Time Well Spent, Jermaine Azu from the Pregame Podcast, and Taylor from the Total Soccer Show, who came all the way from Richmond to do this podcast panel at Fairfax. So I really appreciate that. So please enjoy this episode. The audio was lent to us, or I guess belongs to GMU Student Media, which is a great organization on campus helping students get connected with experience in doing media, such as the Fourth Estate newspaper, the Mason Cable Network, some other, the Volition, I believe, some other things. So it's a great organization on campus to give students real concrete experience with working in media. And so they were able to record this, and so this audio belongs to them. I think they'll be sharing it as well, but I wanted to share this audio with the podcast listeners. And if you're interested in getting started with a podcast, this is a good episode to listen to. Welcome to Positive Filter with your host, Philip Wilkerson, a podcast that focuses on friends, family, health, and career with a little self-help around the way. Please join me in this journey for self-improvement, and I hope that what I have to share will make you a better person, thus making the world a better place. Hey, ladies and gentlemen, it's Philip Wilkerson, host of Positive Filter, but also a industry advisor here at Career Services, and we are doing a first ever exclusive, I'm trying to use big words, once in a lifetime, maybe not once in a lifetime, podcast panel. And so today I'm joined by a collection of podcasters in all different aspects of life and all different beginning levels of podcasts, some veterans here and some beginners here. So let me just take a moment, and why don't I have the panelists introduce themselves, the name of their podcast, and maybe their tagline or little quick blurb about what their podcast is about.
Cool. Oh my goodness, I'm gonna pick this up, even though it's gonna screw up your recording sound. But hey everyone, I'm Colleen, and my podcast is Finding the Fantastic. Basically what it is I hate calling it a motivational podcast, but it's a relatable podcast. I got really tired of hearing the motivational speakers out there because it wasn't what I needed. So I said, let me start this thing where I kind of document authentic, real life, relatable stuff. So we just try to find something fantastic between the hustle of surviving life and achieving it.
What's up, everyone? I am Ronald Young Jr. I'm the host and creator of the Time Well Spent podcast. Tagline is the podcast that nobody asked for, yet somebody is listening to. It's a semi-autobiographical cultural commentary told in a narrative format where I'm just taking stories from my life and using them as a way to frame how I see the world, how others see the world as well.
Hello, my name is Jermaine Azu, and I am a co-host of the Pregame Podcast. And this podcast started out in June 2018. Just me and my friends hang out a lot. We're in our 20s, and we decided to talk about the things that we talked about in person on a platform and give other people in our age range the opportunity to discuss and engage in the topics that we have.
This is being recorded, right?
Yeah, it's being recorded live.
So hello to the thousands of people who are in the attendance. You can't tell right now, but there are thousands of people. I'm Taylor Rockwell. I'm one of the co-hosts and founders of the Total Soccer Show, which is a 5 days a week soccer podcast that we started in 2009 and has since grown to be our full-time job. I keep saying we because I'm usually with my co-host, but he is in Richmond right now, so I'm flying solo today.
So that's great. We got sports, we got life, we got motivation, but not motivational speaking. So we got quite a collection of different topics here. So along with those different topics, how did you come about starting a podcast? How did it you say, hey, you know what, I want to just share my message with the world. So, jump in whenever, but, how did you start your podcast?
We started because we kind of didn't want to write about soccer as much. It takes a longer time to do. So we started out on a radio station in Richmond, but then that radio station's rules were that you weren't allowed to advertise or do any sort of call to action. So that's when we moved into the podcast format. And then it just kind of kept growing and growing, and so we stuck with it, and now we're here today, sitting right here.
Excellent.
Yeah.
I wish I could say mine was like professional like that, but mine really started because I was depressed and I had no idea what to do with my life, and I didn't even plan for it to be a podcast. I would record myself on my phone every day, whether it was a good thing or a bad thing, and I'd watch it, and my friends caught wind of it. They're like, Colleen, this stuff's hilarious, you should post it. I'm like, nobody's gonna care about my problems. And they were like, whoa, way to be selfish, because everybody else got those problems too. So I was like, okay, yeah, I don't mind putting that out there, and boom, podcast.
There you go. I love it. You look at Jerron. Yeah.
So I've been kind of in and around audio production a good portion of my life. Like I used to do commercial radio as an intern, which was a horrible experience. Wouldn't recommend it to anyone. But I always wanted to continue. Sorry, are you in commercial radio?
For like 20, 30 years.
I'm so sorry. We can talk more offline. But anyway, I still got caught by the recording bug, and the podcast wave started taking off a few years ago, and it was when I was heavy listening to a lot of NPR shows, and I started to think I would love to do something like this. I was getting into a lot of Facebook arguments about random stuff, political, all that, and I started to think that people couldn't understand what I was saying, maybe because I was writing it. So I'm like, if they could just hear the tone of my voice, they would know that maybe it's maybe not as bad as you think it is, or maybe I'm not saying what you think I'm saying. So the first intent was to be able to turn my long-winded statuses into a podcast, but then the podcast kind of became something of its own, and it kind of became more about me being curious about the world and how it works and all that. So that's kind of how it started.
Thank you. So the pregame podcast, this kind of started because I would say I'm the creator of it. And basically what happened was, as I was looking at the timeline, I noticed that a lot of people my age were sort of like pouring into Twitter and Instagram in terms of like expressing themselves. And I realized that there wasn't really like a platform other than that, then people were discussing issues and like commenting on things. So then I decided, let me take some of the stuff I'm seeing on Twitter and make it into polls on Instagram. I started making polls on Instagram, and I realized the more relatable the content was to what I was actually going through in my life, the more response I was getting from other people. I brought it up to my co-hosts, and because we already talk about them in general, and they were like, yeah, why don't we just like put a mic in front of us and like do it in front of it? And then the first episode was a hit, and then we were like, okay, let's just keep going after that. And now we like have a whole system where like we have discussions on Twitter and polls, and then we get people's feedback and intel on certain topics that we all go through.
Excellent. So a lot of y'all, by planned happenstance, right? And or you kind of stayed structured. You did something that was organized, like Twitter or Instagram or your Facebook post, and you found that you wanted to have a separate voice. So you kind of fell into podcasting, right? So everyone's probably seen you in your rhythm. Can you tell us like your first episode? Maybe was it good? Was it trash? What was some, like personally, I had an episode that I re-recorded, I think about 20 times from December to April before I felt comfortable releasing that episode. So can you talk about your first episode and how you, recorded that?
Oh, I totally got this one. So I record all my podcasts live. I do zero editing except for adding background music. So what you see is what you get. And my first podcast, I decided to try to do some cool intro music, and it was awful. And I ended up doing 3 after that, and I quit for a month. I said, I'm not podcasting, this is stupid. And then I started back up, but I left them up, so you can go back and hear it. It's pretty rough.
Good. All right, I'm about to check that out.
So I didn't start my podcast for a long time because I did not want it to sound bad. So because of that,
smarter than me.
And I feel like most of the advice we give is just start it when you're ready, which I'm not opposed to that. But for me personally, it was like I really wanted the quality of sound to be good. So I was really invested in buying editing software and getting my mic. So I think that pushed it back starting maybe about a year or so. So but the worst part about it is I made up in my mind, I was like, I just want every episode to be better than the last, which I achieved. But the problem is, if you go back and listen to the first episode, this is some hot garbage in terms of like production value and what I was aiming for. But at the time, I was very proud of what I put out. So
Excellent.
I would say the first episode that we made for the pregame podcast was very rough. We kind of didn't know what we were getting ourselves into. So we had like one mic that you would use, I guess, to record like music or something like that, and we would like turn it different directions and like pass it around. And it was hard to pick up sound. And you can hear it in the first episode. It's just, and you can hear like stuff in the background, phones ringing, like the air on, like you just hear everything. But you know, the consistency is key. So with every episode, you just get better and better and better. And now it's like, we sit down and we do it, and we don't really have to edit that much because the flow is there, the chemistry's there. So yeah.
Perfect.
And then for us, we were like a little more polished, I think, because we had to be, because we were pitching it as a pilot episode for the radio. Mm-hmm. So we still did the same thing of like, I think it took us 6 months to get our pilot episode done, because we'd listened to all these different sports podcasts and we had all these ideas that we liked and we wanted to incorporate. But when I think it could like max be 27.5 minutes. So we had like 6 different segments we were going to do. I think one segment went like 15 minutes and we were like, that's not going to work. So we had to kind of really tighten everything up like piece by piece. So we ended up re-recording a lot of segments. And then the other thing, like I'm okay with talking. When you put a mic in front of me, at least at first, I was just like, there's a thing here now and I don't know what to do. So I would just sort of ramble, and we would get to the end of a segment and my co-host would be like, do you know what you were saying? I was like, no, I have no idea. Like I was just talking, I forgot everything. So it took a little bit of time to get used to that, sort of knowing that it was being recorded and like not being in my head about it. And once we got past that, I think it helped with the fluidity a little bit.
And he's great, so everyone has their growing pains, as they would say. So I think another question I have is, a lot of y'all talked about structure and organization and finding a rhythm. Can you, for the people that want to start a podcast, what have been some tips, suggestions, tools, or anything, to get yourself in a rhythm? For me, I think one of the things that helped me was I had to start making outlines. Like I would make outlines, whether I had a guest or not, and I would, make it a shareable document. And then it kept me from rambling, as you would say. So what are some ways to stay on topic, or some tools that you did?
One thing for me, which I think everybody else here discovered faster than I did, is that when you kind of talk about your genuine experience or your genuine beliefs or whatever, you can communicate them much more effectively. When I was like trying to be a pundit a little bit and trying to talk about things the way I thought other people would, that was when I started to kind of just ramble on. But when you can kind of be like, what do I actually genuinely feel about this and how do I want to convey that, that really helped me kind of clarify what I was trying to say.
Excellent.
I think format plays into this as well, because it sounds like you guys have roundtable podcasts.
It was just 2 of us now. Okay. Yeah, we started out that way though.
And yours is like stream of consciousness.
Sure.
Okay.
I don't really know the technical terms.
Okay, so mine's more narrative. So like in terms of planning, like I was on a show once where we did, it was called Talking Loud and Say Nothing, where we did advice and all that, and I found working in that was a lot easier to actually put out episodes, because we were talking and we could talk about, you could just set up a topic and just start talking. But with narrative podcasts, like they really take some planning and what story you want to tell, how you want to write script, and the editing is very heavy. So in terms of rhythm, it really just comes down to outlining, like you said, and sticking to deadlines. Like if you set a deadline, the hardest taskmaster to work for is yourself. So if you set yourself a deadline, you really have to hold yourself tight to it so that you don't fall out of rhythm.
Okay, my format. It's selfish. It's for me. It's in that moment in the car when I'm really dealing with something or thinking about something, and how I work through it in my own brain, and then just trying to communicate it out vocally. Because again, I started my show for myself, a way to communicate. I needed to hear out loud what was going on in my head, almost to validate myself. So my podcasts are actually like 6.5 minutes long. They're very, very short. And I know I have to come up with what the specific struggle is, or thing, or happiness, and communicate that, and then I just let my stream of consciousness roll out about it. That's my format. It's when you're just thinking and going through something in your own mind.
Now, I think we got some good tweets here, and I think they kind of roll right into that. So, like, how do you keep your content fresh, not only for your listeners, but for yourself as well? And, I think that's, thinking about content. Shout out to Matt. He's in there in the audience there. So how do you keep it fresh? But then also at the same time, when I think about keeping it fresh, like as you said, your podcast is for you. So I want to keep it fresh. I want people to listen, but at the same time, I don't want to change who I am and be non-authentic, inauthentic? I don't know the word, but you don't want to be fake just to appease an audience that's not there. So how do you balance keeping it fresh, but also keeping it authentic and genuine to yourself?
Mine is just because it's everyday life. People ask me all the time, how'd you come up with that topic? How'd you come up with that content? And I'm like, do y'all ever get stuck in traffic? Do y'all ever get dumped? Do y'all ever get stereotyped and judged? All of that's my content. So it's kind of, I'm cheating, I guess.
Yeah.
For us, because we're 5 days a week talking about soccer, there's lots of stuff to talk about. But then, I think it also is, like, for us, in terms of keeping it fresh and keeping it genuine, we try to have more just actual conversations about a topic instead of the kind of, the joke we always make is before Champions League soccer, there's always, I think it's like Colin Cowherd is always on, and they're always, I think every week, it's like, is LeBron the greatest? And it's like, we're still doing this one, huh? We haven't settled that? Like, I hope we debate it again. And so it feels like there's so much of that format that we actively try to avoid that and instead talk about, like, well, why did that actually happen, as opposed to, like, that's the best goal of all time. No, it's not. This is the best goal of all time. Yeah. That doesn't really get the conversation anywhere.
Yeah. LeBron is the GOAT, though, so.
One thing that I think we do to keep things creative and keep things fresh is that we'll engage with our audience on social media. So we have a topic, and you probably, based on listening to our other episodes, will know my approach or other people's approach probably. But when we incorporate that conversation with other people who are on social media, you get a whole lot of different perspectives and opinions and experiences as well. Another thing that we do that kind of like keeps things fresh with the creativity is we sort of like go through like hashtags, if you will, and like find like, so when we have a creative like concept, we'll like think about it in a way where it's like, let's like dig deep and like go into some things to, I guess, bring out more content. Like, we just dig deep and like bring out content out of the internet. Like, I don't want to say like the dark parts of the internet, but just like we go in there to like try to find stuff.
The dark web. All right.
Yeah.
Excellent.
Okay, actually, I just want to jump on that and say that's a super good point, because I think my wife was the one who helped us like monetize our podcast, and her point was like, if you can kind of establish a community that cares about the show and cares about what you're doing, then you can kind of build that community. And so a big part of that is interaction, Twitter, Instagram, whatever. If you kind of get people involved in the conversation, or you're incorporating other people's ideas, and it's how we've done some ads, is like we take suggestions from people on Twitter, and so the more people feel like they're a part of the show, the more they want to listen to it, the more engaged of an audience you'll have.
Excellent. I mean, actually, you kind of rolled into a question that just came off my head. Is we want to talk about, like, this is we're at Career Services, you're here talking to students, but we need to talk about how you make money. Like, how do you make money? So for beginner, let's not talk about where you are now. What was the beginning steps to monetize your podcast? Or if you have goals, like if you want to monetize your podcast, what you want to do. So let's start with either one who's already monetizing their podcast or who wants to monetize their podcast.
I agree with, what's your name on the corner? I'm so sorry.
I'll talk with Taylor.
I have learning disability, so I forget things. There you go. That works for me. For me to monetize it, when I started it out, it was for me. And I agree, because the community and the tribe I built around what I was doing is what enabled me to create and monetize this thing. Because I literally, I created a sponsorship, because some of my people were coming to me like, dude, we want merchandise, we want sponsorships abilities. I'm like, look, man, I don't have 10,000 downloads. They're like, we don't care, we want you to continue talking. And I was like, really? So I just put something on a document, sent it out. That night I had a bunch of people reach out to me. So it's really, it's galvanizing a community of people who get what you get and want to just make sure they support you. That's how I did it.
Well, can I have a follow-up question to that? So who were the people, when you made that document, who did you send it out to?
I posted it on the Facebook.
Oh, there you go. All right. Excellent.
And so was that like a Patreon sort of thing?
What?
Was that like a Patreon? Like when you said you sent it out to people, was that like to take donations?
No, I created a PDF document with like 4 packages, like sponsorship for the show. I'll post something on my social media, things like that. And I said, if you're interested, DM me. And they did.
Wow.
That's super. That's super effective. I commend you for that. No, I was gonna say, like I kind of do what you do, but just with Patreon. So I just built a community there, and for everybody that's really excited about the show, those are my patrons there. So I don't have many at 22, but they're enough right now for all the little things that I need to do in terms of keep the podcast going. But in terms of it becoming a money-making machine, it's not. I'm definitely a little ways off from that happening yet.
My podcast makes no money. It just takes money at this point. But definitely, like, some things that I think about in the future are definitely, to get it more out there, probably advertising. I really like the idea of, like, the packages. I feel like that's very cool. I haven't thought about it that far, but you definitely get the vibe that you might need, like, 10,000 downloads. Like, you might need a large amount so that you can, like, actually, like, maybe 10 out of the 10,000 or a couple out of 10,000 will look at you and try to, like, actually make some purchases. But I like what I'm hearing here, and I'm taking all of it in. So
yeah, he's taking notes. There you go. And I think these are great ideas.
One thing we found, because we've monetized a couple different ways. I think, like, to Colleen's point, if you can get an engaged audience, that audience then will, like, kind of be more inclined to try stuff. So even if you only have 500 listeners, if those 500 are really dedicated and you read an ad for something, you're maybe just as likely to get 50 people as a person with 10,000 who kind of does a generic ad read. So we found trying to make them, like, dynamic and incorporated into the ad helps with actual, like, acquisition in terms of being able to keep advertisers happy. So that's one way. And then we have sort of a Patreon. When we started, I don't know if Patreon was around or if, like, why we ended up not using it, but we have various levels that we've established, and now we have, like, I think, like 400 or 500 who are on that level. So between those two, we've been able to kind of make it our full-time thing.
That's excellent. Now, we got we're going to pull it back from the money part. We got actually 2 questions that are kind of related. One is, how do you get past the fear of sounding boring or like an idiot when you create and post your work? Kind of like that ego part.
You can edit.
Yeah. And then how do you get over hearing the sound of your voice, because that would annoy me tirelessly? Fun fact is that I never really listen to my podcast. I sometimes do. I never really listen to it after I record because I hate the sound of my voice. But then I do, and then I'm like, it's not that bad, but it's also, I hate it. So how do you get over that?
I didn't even know, like, that I had a high-pitched voice until we did a tour this summer, and, like, every single person I met was like, I thought you were going to be like a 16-year-old boy. And I'm like, that's fun. That's fun to hear. So it definitely still is, like, a thing I get used to. I don't, like, outside of editing, I don't think I've ever listened to an episode again. So a lot of times we'll get people being like, oh, I can't believe you guys talked about this. I'm like, I have no recollection of that, nor do I want to go back and listen to it.
Yeah, exactly.
I'm not a 14-year-old boy, by the way. Just want to add that. Cool.
No.
So
glad I got that out there.
Somebody's asked me this question before. For me, it was a matter of, like, just you kind of have to fall in love with the sound of your own voice at some point, and not in a way that's conceited or pretentious, but just in a way that you're very aware of how you sound when you say certain things. So I listen to my podcast a lot. Like, when I post an episode, I'll listen to it about 3 or 4 times and be like, why did you say it like that? Like, why didn't you say it like this? So once you get used to hearing how you sound and then saying, oh, it's like, podcasting is not very different from voice acting, so it's very much, you have to be able to be expressive and understand what you're actually conveying across. So the more you listen to yourself, the better you get at that. So if you don't like the sound of your voice, I would say start listening to it even more, so that you, like, fall in love with it at some point.
Push past. I like that.
My first question back to someone who were to say that would be, do you value what it is you are saying? Do you value what it is you are trying to communicate out to the people? There's a reason you said, I want to do a podcast. It's because you believe so passionately about something that you have decided to take a platform and scream it out to that audience. If you believe that what you're trying to communicate is of value and important, it doesn't matter how you think your voice sounds. What matters is what you're trying to communicate. So don't doubt your voice. Don't stop and think, I don't sound good. Start thinking, is what I'm trying to communicate important and valuable? And then it's just gonna go from there. I mean, everybody's been in an argument where they've been passionate about something, right? And you're just, oh yeah! That's podcasting.
Can I quick chime in and respond to that?
Yes.
Too? The other part is there's so many people out there that are saying much worse things with worse voices. So I don't understand why, I don't think anyone should be afraid of what they sound like if you believe in what you're saying.
Mm-hmm. I would comment on the part about trying not to sound like an idiot, I guess, not about hearing your voice, but just what you're saying. And if you try to, our podcast is very deliberate in our conversations, so we make sure whenever we lead into conversation, we're talking about our experiences and making things more or less an opinion. And then when we talk, and then we discuss opinions about other people's opinions. So we kind of tie it back into who we are and what we believe in. And so we never really sound idiotic because that's a value or something that we hold in us. So that's kind of how we go about that. And I've started to fall in love with hearing my own voice a little bit, but still, I still kind of get annoyed. But as time progresses.
And I'm just gonna keep jumping on what you've said because and to that point, I think that's if you are authentic in what you're saying and if you're articulating what you genuinely believe, then I think your audience knows that. So even if you do say something that people might not agree with or might be a little bit foolish, I think if you're kind of saying it from a genuine place, you're given a little bit more leeway than if you're just sort of playing a character and then you say some inflammatory nonsense because that's what you think will work.
Yeah, that's true. And I mean, I'll listen to certain episodes with my wife and I'm like, dang, this is how I sound? She's like, yeah. But I was like, well, you married me, so you stuck with me. But I think one of the things that I would say that does scream out is that being authentic. That's nothing you can't, if there was a key point, just talking and being authentic with your opinion, your thoughts. What was some of the unexpected outcomes of your podcast? For instance, I used to, I would just throw this out there and, do this podcast, and then I'd get a direct message or something, and someone said, oh my God, I listened. And I'm like, I didn't even know you were following me on Facebook, something like that. And you really randomly reach out to someone from your high school that you even never talked to. What was some unexpected surprises from starting your podcast that you didn't, the unforeseen part?
This might sound a little bit like a humble brag, so I apologize in advance, but it was right around when we first started, so maybe it was 2009 or 2010. There's a guy, if you follow soccer at all, or maybe followed it in the 90s, there's a guy named Alexi Lalas, big red hair, big red beard, now he works for Fox. And he was doing their, I think their studio analysis, and the game, because they were relying on a Central American feed, it just cut out. So it threw back to him in the studio, and he just kind of froze. He was like, so I guess we'll be back, and he kind of didn't know what to say. So we did a review of that game, and it was a things we learned, and one of the things I learned was that Alexi Lalas needs improv lessons. And again, this is when we were still on the radio, still very small. And he tweeted us the next day and was like, all right, I'll sign up for improv lessons. And that was one where we just had no idea that people were actually listening. That was still in the kind of infancy of I hope maybe we get 10 downloads. So I guess, I don't know if he was just scouring the internet for his own name, but
he's looking for trolls, soccer trolls, man.
Yeah, exactly. And he has his troll moments. So that was definitely a surreal moment that probably helped us out a little bit and was definitely not expected.
Excellent.
So the big moment for, I guess, all of us in our podcast, all three of us, was when we had a Twitter discussion, and it was about what do you love about your 20s and what do you hate about your 20s. So for our podcast, primarily, most of the content that we usually go through is more relationship related, because that's what most people we follow talk about on social media. So we had that conversation, and we saw the engagement on Twitter was at 3,000, 4,000, we were like, whoa, people are actually listening to us, because you know your community's listening, your hub, but you never know how far outside of it you're getting. Mm-hmm. So that was a big moment where it kind of woke us up a little bit, people actually listening to us, and it motivated us more and kind of made us feel more purposeful in what we were doing.
Excellent. Yeah.
I would say for me, it was understanding the ability to break the stereotype. Everybody always says be creative, do this thing, be an artist, be a musician, but there's still stereotypes on it that life puts, right? Life still says, well, if you're gonna do a podcast, you have to do it this way. If you're gonna be an artist, you have to paint this way. And when I first started out my podcast, I did the stereotypical podcasting way that I thought needed to be done. And then I slowly realized this was mine. This was for me. And it didn't matter what life told me I had to follow and do and buy. All that mattered was me being able to communicate what was going on in any way I wanted to. And for somebody with really bad learning disabilities, where communicating is really hard sometimes and understanding is really, really hard, this was mine, and I didn't have to follow any rules. It's my podcast, however creative I want it to be.
Excellent. That's dope.
I think for me, something that was unexpected was, I guess, discovering that in a way this is a form of art that, and I guess I never understood that before, and it wasn't until like late nights editing, when you like just pick a good piece of music or you just hit a fade just correctly, you're just like, I mean, there's times when I'm listening to a piece of tape over and over and over again and just trying to get the perfect amount of like a fade on there. And after I get it done, I hear it and I'm like, man, I did that, you know? So
Yeah.
I get very excited about that. So I guess I like knowing that you're like creating something and it is a form of art. I think that was probably the most surprising or something interesting I discovered while doing this.
And I think we have a good question. I mean, we're talking about unforeseen, benefits, but what was an unforeseen challenge that you faced starting out? Like for instance, I guess, never thinking about sound just cutting out during the middle of your podcast, and you just had this good content, you got to start from scratch, and you're like, dang, I didn't know my computer, my internet was going to cut out. So what was some unforeseen challenges that you had starting out?
I think I'll go right back to editing.
Yeah.
Because the minute I thought I was good at editing, and then the first couple episodes, it took so long just to put out one episode because it felt like just a monumental effort. So that was probably one of my biggest challenges starting off. Now it's kind of just getting people to realize that I have a podcast.
Yeah, the marketing, yeah.
You know how many people be like, oh, you have a podcast? For 2 years now.
Yeah.
Do you still get the is it a blog? Or I get that all the time, and
My
it's
favorite
super
one is
great.
when they say, I used to watch your podcast all the time.
There you go.
Like,
I did that.
I'm sure you did.
Watch.
I did that all the time.
I did this one thing where if I find out someone has an iPhone, I just automatically send them
do
that.
the same.
I'm like, oh, you got an iPhone? I'll text you. That's what I do. Just like, hello, my name is Phil Wilkerson. Here's my email, and send them to it. So you gotta brand yourself.
And Ronald, you said yours is not necessarily scripted, but you kind of record it out and edit it down, right? Yeah. And I think a key thing there, maybe it applies to both. I'm not sure, but I think a point y'all were making earlier is that if you sort of back yourself to say what you want to say, the less you rely on the edit, I feel like in certain situations, the better it will be. Because if you kind of get in your head about, oh, I didn't say that quite right, you're always sort of rethinking everything you said and you're not really moving forward. Yeah. I don't know if that applies to when you're having it all kind of planned out. Because I think the most we've ever done in that way is 4 minutes. And scripted 4 minutes, even then I was edit. And so it took me a while to get comfortable. So I don't know if that is the same for you or not.
Well, what I found now is that even in conversations that I'm having, because sometimes a part of an episode will be an interview or something like that, what I found now is that I do more editing before I actually even touch a keyboard. Just talking to somebody, be like, say that sentence one more time, but say it like this, So that's actually become easier, being able to listen to edit rather than actually get into it. But yeah, you're right. Once I kind of started having more clear thoughts and thinking in terms of what I need to accomplish now in this recording session, it made the back end a lot easier in general.
Yeah, I've had a number of times when I've had to tell my co-host, you were really enthusiastic when you said that, and that edit's not going to work if you come back. So you have to then get back to that point of yay, I'm really excited again. Otherwise, it goes from I'm really excited to anyway, we're talking about size. No, that doesn't sound the same. That does not work.
And I think one of the things I noticed too is shout out to Ron's podcast. I love his mom's on it. Fan favorite Peggy Lee. I think one of the things I loved about podcasting, and I'm a people person, I love the community. I love random people. My dad was on my podcast. I love bringing my family and friends a part of it. It's not just my individual thing. It's I bring the people I'm cool with. So who are some, when you're thinking about community, who are some of the people that brought you, or your your cheerleaders, your coaches, your people that really fired you up for your podcast and joined in and got in? Can you talk about that real quick?
I would say for me, it was my friend who, when I told her I quit my podcast, she told me to get my butt back in the chair and podcast again.
Yeah.
It's the people who, when I told them I didn't think people were understanding me and I used my disabilities and doubts to fuel my own whatever, not doing this, who said, don't you dare, what you have to say matters, and it doesn't matter if one person listens or just yourself listens, just do it. And they've been my biggest support.
Excellent.
I would say for this, what happened was I would have people tell me that they were sitting with like their friends listening to my podcast. And that's when I realized like, oh, like people care about it. So that's a good feeling that I had that, you know, kind of like fuels it a little bit because you have that support from other people around, and also the special guests like that may just randomly say, hey, can I be on your podcast? Hey, can I be on your podcast? It lets me know that they're engaged as well and they want to be more than just like a poll, if you will.
Yeah, excellent.
A big one for me and my co-host Daryl would be our wives. Hi, wife. Because I think like when we decided to do it full time, that was like 2014 is when we decided. And I think for most people, if they told their partner, like, yeah, I'm just going to focus full time on doing a podcast, it's like, okay. Like, how are you going to make money? Like, how's that going to be a thing? And they were just, I think, supportive from the get-go because they wanted us to be doing something we wanted. But I think if we hadn't had like those types of people in our lives, it would have made it that much harder because when we first started, we were both working 40 hours a week still, or the four of us when we first started. And so it was like some nights I was in the studio till 2 and then awake at 8 to go like work full time and then go do it again. And I think a lot of other people would have been like, no, like one of these has to go and it's probably not the one that actually gives you a paycheck. Yeah. And so having like those, like that sort of support really, I think gave us the confidence to keep going.
And this is great. This is a random question just popped up, but what would you have wished before you started podcasting? What would you have wished that you knew?
That I started earlier. I wish I would have started in college.
Yeah.
Honestly, because I'm 34 now, and now I'm working on a plan to stop working full time and do audio production full time, whether that's in the form of my podcast or producing for others, whatever. But I just sometimes think about if I would have started this 10 years ago, how much closer I'd be. But you can't get too caught up in that. Right. Drive yourself crazy.
Yeah.
I think for me, I've talked about this a little bit like in other situations, but that like sitcoms are liars is a big thing that I would say that like, because in every sitcom, like I always say it's like Family Guy. Like Family Guy, every episode Peter decides to do something and then gets really successful at it and like the whole town cares. No one cares when you start a podcast. Like people around you might care, but you've got to kind of like get through the idea that everybody in the city is going to be listening and I'm going to be some like podcast like celebrity. Like maybe one day, but like you've kind of got to know that it's going to be a slower process, that you're not going to go from like 0 to 10,000 downloads in a month. It takes that kind of grind and sticking with it, which I like, and sometimes you're going to want to walk away and then you come back and you kind of have that rejuvenation, you stick with it and it grows from there, but it takes effort.
Yeah, that's dope. I like that. That's like, I'm getting fired up because some of us are more beginner, but go ahead.
I want to talk about uncertainty. So, I mean, you can start the podcast probably with a plan or like where you want to see it or how you want it to grow. And things might not go as you planned or as you envisioned. But you should try to adjust to that. And I feel like that's something that we're learning as we podcast because, we were in a situation where like, we could podcast every week or like, twice a month. And sometimes it just doesn't work out that way, especially when life happens and we're all young and in college. So, but that's one thing that, I kind of wish I knew, like there was going to be more uncertainty and things weren't going to go as I had like envisioned or planned.
So I'm a big dreamer, right? I like to just play into what if. What if I just handed you guys, each of you individually, $100,000 to do something with your podcast? What would you do with that $100,000?
I'm ready. I can answer that right now. I would quit my job tomorrow and then immediately start. I would quit my job tomorrow, pay the rent for the rest of the year, and then immediately start traveling to book interviews for my podcast. Then I would probably hire a second editor, probably second and third editor, and I'd probably start posting more frequency. Because right now I'm like putting it out maybe once a month. So with that type of money and time, I could at least put it out maybe twice a month.
Yeah.
I'm just trying to be conservative, but yeah, like immediately. Do you have $100,000 or is this?
Yeah, man. Shit. I was trying to do that vitamin.
Actually, I have it.
I was trying to do that vitamin water, no cell phone, but the vitamin water is faking. I don't know. Where's my money? Like I was gonna do it. No smartphone for a year, but I ain't got $100K. I'm sorry, y'all. Hey, so yeah, Jermaine, what'd you do with that money? Look at he's not even gonna do a podcast
Like
anymore.
I was like, maybe we could like market or like book some like, you know, kind of like book interviews, but like I think Ron hit it on the head. Like he has like this whole plan that I'm gonna like steal, so it's like great. But I feel like definitely I would take care of some things that would allow me to have the more space time to dedicate to the podcast. And then but it's like I'm one of like 3, so I feel like we all gonna want a piece of the pie.
What's that? Like 30? That's 33.
That's 33 each.
They're not here. They don't need to know.
Okay, so I guess it's all me. Yeah. But yeah, definitely I feel like marketing is a big thing. Social media marketing, like if you can get your podcast like at least like looked at by a lot of eyes and have something that's interesting that catches people and draws them to like something sort of like clickbait, then you can kind of like engage them from there and then keep it going.
I would buy myself a new computer because it takes me an extra hour because my computer's slow. But no, for real, marketing is probably where I would put that money. I'd keep my job as much as I'd want to quit the job, but Finding the Fantastic, to me, I'm trying to make it more than just a podcast and a show. I'm trying to make this belief in a different lifestyle than what you have, which is following this stereotype of just get a job, pay your bills, and die. So marketing for starters, for sure.
And then I think for us it would be expansion, probably, because there is so much soccer every single day, and there's so much to it, because there's like the cultural aspect, there's different leagues, there's like the women's game and the men's game, and we try to cover as much of everything as we can. But I feel like for the Women's World Cup this summer, we might try to get like pay some people to do a Women's World Cup show, because there's like 5 other tournaments at the same time, and we want to be able to kind of focus as much as we can on the individual tournaments and not have it just be a very general thing. So I think we would probably try to expand into like different shows that maybe don't exist the way we like think could work.
I was surprised none of y'all said make a festival, you know what I'm saying, and rent out an island, you know what I'm saying? Fire.
Yeah, I was gonna say.
Fire festival, I had the podcast festival with Ja Rule.
He probably needs the money.
So I'm a tangible person. I set goals, obtainable goals, and one of my goals for myself was to be weekly. And I said I have a whiteboard in my house, and I say I want to do this. What is one, let's just speak into 2019. What is one 2019 goal that you have for your podcast?
So all of 2018, I was struggling trying to find a way to interview people. I had done it previously, and it sounded like chicken soup for the mother's soul. Yeah. And that's not what my podcast is about. But I knew it was more than my own issues going on. I needed to get other people's real life experiences and get their voice, through my podcast. So my goal was to figure out a way to do that. Since then I have. So for 2019, my goal is every week to produce somebody else's voice on Finding the Fantastic.
Excellent.
I have 3. The first is the first 2 are ideas that I've had about shows that I've wanted to do or episodes that I've wanted to do that I haven't done yet because they're complicated. But I feel like I've been podcasting long enough now that I know how to tackle them. So I'd like to get those done. One by July, and one possibly earlier than that. So pray for me. And then the other is I want to do a live show. I've wanted to do one for a while, but the logistics have been like a little intimidating. So if I could pull that off in the second half of 2019, I'd be pretty proud.
Excellent.
For our podcast 2019, I feel like one of the goals that I set for us was kind of to expand more on on social media. So we already engage in live discussions. We already have a wide audience, but market more, get more in other communities that are not just like George Mason and its surrounding, if you will. So that's the main goal for 2019. And I feel like another goal that's sort of come up recently is just to sort of like refine the balance so that we can like be friends but podcast, because it's hard. I was telling What's your name again? Taylor. Oh, I was gonna say
No.
I was gonna say I was gonna say something outlandish. Thank God.
What were you gonna guess my name was?
Stanley.
Stanley. Okay.
Stanley.
I don't know why. I have no clue why. But
Wow.
yeah. So
that should be your alter ego, Stanley.
So Taylor and I were talking, and and basically, I was talking about how like you can have friends making a podcast, and then when you make a podcast so much, it's not like you lose the fun, but it almost becomes like work and a job, which is hard for the chemistry because now it's no longer like fun, but it's like, okay, we have to sit down and do this and like edit it and record it, and it's like that's not the purpose of us. We're like friends first and foremost. So sort of like refining that balance so we can kind of still do both. Yeah. So.
I mean, first off, you were kind enough to keep this sheet right here. So in the very beginning, I had all the names in front of me. Otherwise, I would have forgotten them all too. So yeah, there you go. Now you remember me. But that really was. I was like, yes, definitely was Ronald. All right. I think that's a really good point, and that's something that my podcast partner and I struggle with at times because we're in the studio a lot. And there's definitely like when there's a major tournament, if there's the World Cup or something, we see each other way more than we see our wives because we're in there. We cover every single game and watch every single game.
I see her shaking her head. Okay.
Oh yeah, so we'll watch every single game. We'll record like full game reviews. So we'll be in there for like 14 hours. And when you're around somebody that much, it's really difficult to kind of have that balance of like business partners, but then also like, do you want to get a drink afterwards? Like, I spent 16 hours with you. Like, not really, but I guess we should. So that's really hard. And then like a personal goal for me is like, it's really hard with a sports podcast to like kind of balance the stick to sports idea, and we, I think, have done a better job of it lately because I don't think I'll offend, but like things are so abominable, it's really hard to kind of just be like, yeah, things are great. Let's talk about sports. Like, sure. I think we.
What do you mean, what's going on?
Oh yeah, it's just easy, right? One of the ones right after Trump got elected, the USA played Mexico in a World Cup qualifier, and like all the players, like usually you have like a Mexico photo and a USA photo, and all the players like stood together, intermingled.
Yeah.
And even just talking about that, we would get like. Not even saying like that, like I think we said that was great. We were really excited, and we got a ton of responses of just like, we don't talk about that. And I think at the time, really not even at the time, a little bit before that, we were sort of inclined to do that, and I think we've kind of just been like, nah, like things are so abnormal that like it's not worth sticking to sports, I guess. But that's a hard thing to know when you're doing too much and when people are like do want to just hear about sports content versus everything else that's going on.
I have a question.
Yeah.
All right,
I was about to say, yeah. Go ahead.
And anybody can answer this. So then, because my podcast, the first year I did it was 2017, and the first one came out January 2017. So the third episode I did was called Banned, and it was talking to my Somalian friend about the Muslim ban.
Yeah.
And then I remember as I was recommending to my coworkers, they were like, oh, I like your podcast, but it got a little political at one point. And I was like, I don't think talking about human rights is political. But anyway, how do y'all toe the line of saying, like talking about like whatever you're about to talk about, and then just like going in on whatever political
self-censorship, you would say. Self-censorship, yeah.
So for me, this is kind of a big one just because I am talking like with my podcast, I try to keep it super authentic and issues I'm dealing with. And for the most part, I'm going to have an opinion on the issue I'm dealing with. We talk a lot about mental health, disabilities, and things like that. And I remember there was a time where I was like, well, I shouldn't say that. Maybe I should stop and think this out before I even, podcast it live. And then it hit me that, you know what? I can't cater to everyone. If I make somebody mad, maybe they're not the right person to listen to Finding the Fantastic. So I had to make the conscientious choice to say, okay, I'm going to piss some people off. It's my opinion. It's my podcast. Come see, come stop. Just kind of is what it is.
That's really good.
Honestly, I think the way you approached it is probably the way that we would do it, which is if you have someone telling their story and telling their experience, anybody who's like, how dare they tell about their life is sort of like, all right, well, maybe you don't need to listen. Exactly, yeah. So I think what we've tried to do is find like the people that could better reflect on that than we could. Because I mean, like, to be honest, like we're like my co-host and I are both white guys. And so there's a lot of issues that I don't feel like we can talk about. So we try to have other people on. One that's been really good for us is there's a a site called Black Arrow, which is like the intersection of black culture and soccer. And for us, that's been a really good outlet for talking about issues. Like we got one randomly, like we do listener questions all the time, and we had one that was like, why aren't there more black coaches in soccer? As like, it was like a quick, like, if you guys got time, like, I know I got one more question. And I was like, yeah, man, I don't really know if I can speak to that. So then we had somebody on who could inform in a much more specific way than us being like, there should be, and we'd like there to be. And so I think that's the way I think that I would say is the best way, aside from you talking about your own experiences, having people on who can do that from their perspective.
So I think I like this. I want to give you an opportunity to ask each other a question. You can go through and ask a question, and then we'll wrap up. So ask each other as panelists a question that you think is burning in your mind. Ronald, you already did yours. You're done. No more questions for Ronald. You're done. Turn his mic off.
I'm curious. Do y'all feel pressure to, like, do you try to put it out like the same week, the same day, the same minute, or is it just kind of whenever you're ready for it to go out?
So luckily, I used to try to stick to a schedule, and then I fell off. The first 2 years I fell off. This is my third year doing it. And when I say fell off, just fell off the schedule that I was doing it with. And so now, because of the way my Patreon is set up, I actually, if I don't post that month, then I don't get money. Mm-hmm. And I set it up like that on purpose. So I'm like, all right, so now there's like a sword of Damocles or a guillotine hanging right there. Yeah. Like, you're not going to get paid if you don't do this. So now I try to do basically whatever the last business day of the month is every mm-hmm. month. That's when I try to release. So.
For me, when I first started, I was doing like 5 podcasts a week. And it just got a little stale just because it was so much. And then I started doing it just happenstance every Monday evening. And I remember I got sick one Monday, and I had like 10 people message me saying, hey, what's going on? You okay? Why aren't you podcasting? What's happening? And I'm like, dude, I got like pneumonia right now. What do you want? So yes, the answer to your question is I try to do it every Monday, the actual podcast recording and the live video. And then like Tuesday, I do like a quote post. Like I try to keep it live and going every day, but the actual podcast is Monday evening. So I'm gonna go home and do that.
Yeah.
So for us, what we like to do is the polls, right? So when you have a poll, it's kind of like you can tell, like, if I answer the poll or ask the poll question and the podcast doesn't come out till a month later, I know that it was kind of delayed. That happens sometimes. So we try to release it like the week we recorded, but in reality that doesn't always happen. But luckily for us, our content is kind of like timeless. So even if it's released a month later, it's a topic that's still relevant, that still applies even now. Yeah.
I would say, like, and I'm a moderator, but I got a podcast. Shout out to myself. But I did the thing. I found that I needed consistency for me. I'm along the same mindset as Ronald, that I had to set my own deadline and consistency, because if I didn't, I'd fall off on my own. So I do every Monday at 6 a.m. Now, do I record live? No. What I do is I just load up as many recordings as I can. I don't say like, this episode is about Thanksgiving. I just talk about timeless issues. And so I have like 5 in the queue, and I just set it and forget it, because you can schedule your episodes to go out. So I do that so I don't feel rushed. So like this morning I dropped one at 6 a.m., but I recorded it like 3 weeks ago. And that's going to keep me in a system to keep me consistent. And then, like, as I said, I won't be like, this Tuesday, January 24th. I'm not going to say any dates so that it doesn't seem weird when it's released on a Monday.
I've totally done that, and I was like, Colleen, you're an idiot. And I actually said it on the podcast. I was like, it's Christmas Eve. And then I said, well, for all of you who will listen to this in a month, it's no longer Christmas Eve.
Yeah. So, and any other questions for each other as a panelist?
I do have a question. So in regards to the community of podcasters, since I'm fairly new, March will be a year for me. How do you guys find the community, and have you found the community and then connect with each other? Outside of, oh my God, I saw you have a podcast on iTunes.
There's Facebook groups in the area. There's the DC podcasters, something or another. Then there's the DCs. There's an editing group on Facebook. There's a bunch of them on Facebook. And then there's a bunch of, like, if you go on Twitter, there's a lot of podcasters that talk on Twitter in general. Easy ways to find them using the hashtag Tripod Podcast. You can find them that way. And then you literally just have to always talk about having a podcast.
Yeah.
Like, if you do that more often than not, you're going to run into somebody. It's kind of like being a rapper.
You, Tinder date, what do you do? Well, I have this podcast, and it's really great.
Well, actually,
there you go.
So when I was single, I used to
I'm so excited for what's about that.
Yeah, I'm ready for this too.
So when I was single, it was not. I got probably a lot of podcast fans from Tinder / Bumble. Not a lot of girlfriends, but a lot of podcast.
Oh my God, I gotta sign up.
because what I would do, it actually works. What I would do is they'd be like, "Tell me more about yourself." I was like, "Well, why don't you go listen to my podcast?" So they go listen to a couple episodes. Hey, this is pretty good. Be like, "Ooh, great!" And then we. Not necessarily with a date. Come on up. Like, when we go on a date.
I'm starting a Bumble and Tinder in case anybody wants to follow me.
Well, yeah, you'd be surprised. Like, word of mouth is the most effective.
Yes, old school word of mouth. I agree with you. I'm in group meets for podcasts. I'm in groups for podcasts. I legit say, hey, my name is Philip Wilkerson. I got a podcast. like it's just like, Maggie, my wife, gets like so annoyed, but it's like, it becomes like you gotta hustle. You just gotta, if it's something you're proud of, I say like, hey, I got 2 kids and a podcast. And that's kind of how the community grows, just being yourself.
That makes me really happy because we were talking on the way up. I kind of hate the word podcast, to be honest, because I feel like there's just such a weird. I think it's just because every time my parents ask me about it, they're like, is it a podcast? Like it's just this weird sort of. It has that same connotation to me as the blog. So hearing everybody be really excited about it, I'm like, okay, yeah, never mind. Podcasts are good. I like podcasts.
I call it, for people that don't know, I call it an online radio show because like my grandparents don't, like my aunts and uncles, like, what's that? I say it's an online radio show that you are the radio host, and they're like, oh.
Yeah, my grandmother just thinks our radio show is played online. That was the easiest way to do it.
It's a radio show online. That's what I call it.
Yeah.
So simplify it.
But to your question, in our experience, it was that like people, I think, generally are good and want to like help and want to talk. And so I think a lot of it was finding people who we like to either, like for us, it was who like writers we really liked, not necessarily players because they've got a lot of like PR and media, but like anybody who you think you would want to have on the show, like I would just say contact them. Because really, I think it's people are more likely to come on your show or anyone's show than you might realize. Mm-hmm. And it's just about, and the worst they can do is not respond. So that's what we did, is just kind of pursued people that we wanted to have on, and sometimes it worked and sometimes it didn't.
Jermaine, anything?
We're kind of fresh on the podcast scene too, so we're a little younger than you, but like we have one community that we're into, and the only one we're into is the one that you added me to. Yeah. And I see a lot of support and a lot of love there, and I know that whenever I post something there, it's gonna get listened to by somebody in there, and it's reciprocated too. We listen to some of the content. So
what about your other networks? We're gonna have to do a little flash. A5A. Do you meet a new brother and say, hey, I got a podcast?
Yeah, I definitely do. And but it's because I'm still in that college vibe. So a lot of people, I guess, who are in the fraternity at my age are also like going through similar stuff, so they listen. But I guess that's not really like a podcast community, but that is a community that I reach out to. I always put in all of my communities that I'm involved in just to get more viewership.
I have one more question.
Yeah, go ahead.
I was just gonna ask you, because it sounds like all of yours are very like connected to your experience. Do you feel like a motivation, or do you feel like an obligation to sort of end like on a positive, or to like kind of like, I guess like yours, for example, it's motivational, correct? Or not really? Not really? It's more just like life experience?
It's more just relatable.
Okay, so I guess that maybe that answers it then. I'm just wondering, like, do you all, like, when you're kind of putting yourself out there, do you feel the need to have it like come to a conclusion at the end of the episode, or at the end of like the series or whatever, or is it just sort of it ends when it ends?
No, I've ended with, I really don't know. Thanks so much. I kid you not.
Yeah.
So mine typically tend to wrap, because I always like whatever thought that I started in the beginning, I always like to contextualize it at the end. Mm-hmm. So typically I try to bring it down to a solid point. Sometimes some episodes I do a better job of that than others, but typically I try to say, all right, that's the end. Hope you guys have a good night. There's some sort of wrap towards the end. So
interesting.
Yeah, we'll usually wrap with like a joke or something corny or something funny just to get the audience like laughing towards the end and, fade it out with some music. But we generally come to like a follow us at this, generally. So that's how we kind of like to end it.
And I like to say, it's positive filter, so I don't want to, I try to the point is I take everyday situations and try to end on a high note, so I don't be like, and life sucks. So I don't do that. So I try to even reframe obstacles, and I am very authentic about like struggles that I've had and obstacles, but I definitely am studying well-being and positivity, and not just in a sense of kumbaya, but actual like studying it like, you know, the act of being happy and actively trying to do things to increase your well-being. So I try to end, at least if it's not like something like it's solved now, I try to end every episode with at least some tips or some things that even I'm using to employ positivity, whether it's like just, as a listener, this is something I'm working on too, you know, I'm trying. And so I try to end on that little, if it's not like I'm up here, I try to end it, I'm climbing, at least trying to climb and go up. Yeah, so now let's end on that positive note.
There you go.
I'd like to say closing words. Like, what would be, you know, closing words for anyone? The thousands of people are here tonight, Fire Festival. But what would be some closing thoughts that you would have for the listeners of the podcast?
So I always tell people, no matter whatever it is, understand and realize that you can break life stereotype. And just because life says you have to do one thing and you have to do it a certain way, doesn't mean you have to do it that way. We are diverse, independent individuals. And if we find a way to express ourselves and we are comfortable with it, we can truly change the world.
Yeah, I would second that, and also say if you want to start a podcast, if you're interested in it, go ahead and start. You don't have to wait. Just make a goal to improve with every episode, and it takes time. Like every little bit that you do continues to improve your show. So just try to take little steps and continue to improve.
Yes, and I would say to everyone who listens to the podcast, mostly the 20-year-olds, we're all going through wild stuff right now, but there is always support in the community and in other people, especially with the podcast. We like to get viewership who are under 20 and over 20, so we can answer questions for those who are coming up and also get advice from those who are like older than us. So keep listening, keep staying engaged, and feel free to DM any topics or any issues that you feel like you need some help with or you need some guidance for, or something that you feel like should be talked about because it would help somebody else.
Yeah, I'm going to be a technical nerd and say if you're going to start a podcast, my biggest piece of advice is have good audio quality. Because really, I think that's the biggest thing we've heard the most is like if you tune in and it's like recorded off like the laptop mic and there's a bunch of noise, like people will switch off. So I think like having that like a little bit of technical precision is really good. And then I think the other thing that like we still do a soccer show, but we've changed the format a lot from when we first started. And I think I think you start a show, but just don't be afraid to change it, to have it evolve. The one I always go to, I think I stole from Silicon Valley, but like I think Instagram started as like a location app, and then they're like, oh, well, we could just put photos and you could tag where the photos are, and now they're Instagram. So I feel like if you just start the show and kind of figure out what works, and if you want to keep with soccer, actually no, we want to have it be more about like society, and then whatever. Like I think it's about getting it started. That's the hardest part.
All right, and I also want to leave a moment without closing thoughts, but shout out to the plug yourselves. So where can people find your podcast? Mine is Positive Filter, at Positive Filter on Instagram, Twitter, and Facebook. But where can you find your podcast?
We're Total Soccer Show, and we also do the Top Drawer Soccer Show. Both of those are available on iTunes.
Okay.
So we have the Pregame 3 as our social media, so that's THEPREGAM 3 on Twitter and Instagram, and then we're on SoundCloud as well as the Pregame Podcast, like the Pregame Podcast, not Pregame Podcast. And Pregame is one word, so PREGAME. There we go. And we're also on Apple platforms as well.
You can find Time Well Spent on Spreaker, Stitcher, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, all of the major podcast outlets. And you can follow me at It's Big Ron. That's OHITSBIGRON. All the social media platforms.
My podcast is Finding the Fantastic. I do not tweet, but you can find me on... it's not meant for people who can't spell, okay? You can find me on Instagram or Facebook, and then I'm on all of the podcast platforms as well, Spotify, iTunes, things like that.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much for your time. I really appreciate it. I think that, the audience or the listeners of this podcast will learn something, and hopefully we'll see someone that comes, they'll say, hey, I started a podcast, and they're like, why did you start it? Because I randomly went to some podcast panel or listened to some podcast panel from Mason, and I just started because it wasn't that serious. So hopefully we inspired someone either physically or out there in the world with our voice. But I appreciate you. Thank you so much for coming. Thank you for listening to Positive Filter, a podcast that focuses on family, friends, career, with a little self-help along the way. If you enjoyed this podcast, please share it with your family and friends, and like the Facebook page, Spreading Positivity of Movement. Thanks for listening.